Unit 20 deals with the respiratory system. This video includes Part A, General Principles, and Part B, Anatomy. The respiratory system includes 4 videos. This one is the first video with Parts A and B. The second video covers Part C, Mechanics of Breathing. The third is Part D, Transport of Gases. And the last video is Part E, Control of Breathing. First of all, what about the general principles? Well, they're pretty straightforward. The respiratory system has 2 functions. Both involve moving gases between air and tissues. They take in oxygen and it gets rid of carbon dioxide. Gases refer to oxygen and carbon dioxide. Respiration has 2 components. External respiration is the exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the blood. It requires 2 different processes. One is ventilation. This is breathing. Ventilation has 2 parts. Inspiration, that's inhaling, for example, inhaling the oxygen, and expiration, for example, exhaling the carbon dioxide. It also involves another process, diffusion, between the lungs, actually alveoli, which are structures within the lungs, and the blood. Now remember, diffusion is a passive process. It involves the movement of particles. If there's a difference in concentration, there's a net movement of particles from their high to their low concentration. We'll refer to this again on several occasions. Internal respiration, on the other hand, is the exchange of gases between blood and tissues. It involves just diffusion. Don't confuse respiration, as we're discussing it, with cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a metabolic process to generate energy. Let's look at the anatomy of the respiratory system. The respiratory system arises from the embryonic gut, that is, the embryonic digestive system or tract. The embryonic pharynx gives rise to the laryngotracheal bud, which becomes ciliated trachea, ciliated bronchi, and ciliated bronchioles. It also gives rise to the alveoli, which are not ciliated. The embryonic gut also gives rise to the pancreas, the intestine, and the liver. Note that the nasal cavities are also ciliated. The thoracic cavity is the chest cavity. Let's enlarge the wall to look at the details. The arrow shows the wall itself, the chest wall, that includes ribs and muscle. And that arrow shows the lung wall. Now notice I put lung wall in quotes. I'll describe why in a moment. The space in between is the pleural cavity, or pleural space. It's actually a potential space rather than a real space. But if you took the lungs out of the chest, there would be a large empty pleural cavity. It's bounded by 2 membranes. The parietal pleura is a thin serous membrane lining the inside of the chest wall, and the visceral pleura is the thin serous membrane covering the outside of the lungs. The mediastinum is a wall separating the 2 pleural cavities. It consists of heart, trachea, blood vessels, and other structures. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle separating the thoracic and abdominal cavities. The lungs, internally, the left lung has a superior and an inferior lobe. The right lung has, in addition to those 2, a middle lobe. We'll refer to the lung as though it were like a balloon with a simple wall and a large space inside. That's why I put it in quotes. This is misleading because the lungs are more like a sponge with a network of many tiny microscopic spaces. The upper and lower respiratory tracts include structures leading to the lungs. These are the upper respiratory tract. They include the nasal cavities, the pharynx, the larynx. The lower respiratory tract includes the lungs and the structures within the lungs, like the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveolar sac. Alveoli are grape-like structures that make up the alveolar sacs. Inspired air passes through the above structures in the order listed. Let's look at the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has conchae, curved extensions that swirl the air. It's bounded by the external nares, the nostrils, the internal nares, the posterior passageway. The floor of the nasal cavity, or the roof of the mouth, is the palate. It's a partition. The anterior part is the hard palate because it contains bone. The posterior part is the soft palate. It lacks bone. Hanging down from the soft palate is the uvula, that little hangy down part you can see if you look in a mirror and open your mouth. The pharynx is a region rather than a distinctive organ, and it has three subdivisions: the nasopharynx in the back of the nose, the oropharynx, the back of the mouth, and the laryngopharynx, close to the larynx. Notice the pronunciation of these words. Larynx is correct, larynx is not. Pharynx is correct. It's not called the pharynx. The air and the food passageways cross in the pharynx, so the air passageways ends up in the anterior part of the neck. The food passageways end up in the posterior part of the neck. The larynx is the voice box. It contains vocal cords or vocal folds. The epiglottis is a flap that covers the entrance to the larynx when swallowing, so it prevents food from going the wrong way. The trachea extends below the larynx into the lungs. Let's look at some additional details. The bronchi are subdivided into a primary bronchi, these are branches of the trachea, secondary bronchi, these are branches of the primary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi, the branches of the secondary bronchi. The bronchioles are extensions of the tertiary bronchi, and they include terminal bronchioles. It's part of the conducting component of the respiratory tree, and the respiratory bronchioles. They lead to the alveoli, and they're involved in respiration. The respiratory tree includes the trachea and its branches. It's almost built like an upside-down tree. The respiratory tree contains smooth muscle in the trachea, bronchi, and the bronchioles. In the bronchioles, the muscle cells wrap around the bronchioles. It contains elastic cartilage, roughly horseshoe-shaped, shown here in yellow. It's present in the trachea, the bronchi, but the cartilage is absent in the bronchioles. Cilia are found in the trachea through the bronchioles. They face the lumen, the space inside, and they're also found in the nasal cavity. They create an upward flow of mucus called the mucociliary elevator. So stuff that's inhaled, dust and so forth, is trapped by the mucus and washed back upward into the nose. It removes impurities that are inhaled. The vocal cords, or properly called vocal folds, are in the wall of the larynx. They're associated with two of the cartilages of the larynx, the arytenoid and cricoid cartilages. The slit between the two vocal cords, that is, between the right and left, is a space called the glottis. The glottis opens when the posterior cricoarytenoid muscle contracts, causing the vocal folds to abduct, that is, they move further apart. The glottis closes when the lateral cricoarytenoid muscle contracts, causing the vocal cords to adduct, that is, to move closer together. The lungs have a dual blood supply. The bronchial artery and vein are part of this systemic circulation. They comprise the nutrient circulation to the lungs. They transport needed oxygen for lung tissue, nutrients to the lung tissue. The pulmonary artery and vein are part of the pulmonary circuit. The role of that circuit, of course, is to pick up oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. The pulmonary circuit has a very low pressure, blood pressure of something like 30/10. Due to the low blood pressure, fluid tends to move into the capillaries, not out, so little fluid accumulates in the lungs. There's little vasomotor control of the circulation in the lungs. Skeletal muscles are used for breathing. The major muscles are the inspiratory muscles, include the external intercostals and the diaphragm, and the expiratory muscles, including the internal intercostals and the abdominal wall muscles. There are some other muscles that play a minor role, the sternocleidomastoid and scalene muscles. Let's look at how some of the muscles work. Take the external intercostals. When they contract, the ribs are raised and the sternum moves outward. When the internal intercostals contract, the ribs are lowered and the sternum moves back toward the chest. Let's look at a side view of the chest. Here's the spinal column, the ribs, and the sternum. Notice the ribs slope from the spinal column downward to reach the sternum. The muscles involved in breathing, the expiratory muscles, decrease the volume of the thorax. The inspiratory muscles increase the volume of the thorax. These are skeletal muscles, so are stimulated by nerve impulses only. Neurons include the expiratory and the inspiratory neuron supply to the muscles. They increase impulse frequency, which will contract the muscles. By decreasing impulse frequency, the muscles will relax. Let's look at the inspiratory muscles. They include the external intercostals located between the ribs, and they slope downward from the spinal column toward the sternum. When they contract, they pull up the ribs. The ribs will rise. They're innervated by inspiratory neurons that are located in intercostal nerves. These are thoracic spinal nerves. The diaphragm is located between the thoracic and abdominal cavities. When the diaphragm contracts, it becomes lower. It's innervated by inspiratory neurons located in the phrenic nerve. Expiratory muscles include the internal intercostal muscles located between the ribs. They slope up from the spinal column to the sternum. When they contract, it pulls the ribs downward. They're innervated by expiratory neurons in the intercostal nerves. These are thoracic spinal nerves, once again. Abdominal wall muscles are also expiratory. They're located, obviously, in the abdominal wall. They contract to compress the abdomen and push the diaphragm up. They're innervated by expiratory neurons in various nerves to the abdomen. Let's look at the alveoli for a moment. These are microscopic sacs. Capillaries arising from the pulmonary artery surround the alveoli in a fine network. The inner surface of the alveolus is lined by a film of fluid. The respiratory membrane is the total inner alveolar surface through which gases diffuse. The respiratory membrane is 2 cell layers thick. The lungs have a tendency to expand. This is called compliance. And they have a tendency to deflate, like an empty balloon. This is due to elasticity of the elastic fibers. This contributes about 1/3 of the function of deflation. And it's due also to surface tension of the fluid. Now, the fluid is mostly water, and you remember that water is sticky. Water sticks together because it has a surface tension. The surface tension of the water contributes about 2/3 of the tendency to deflate. Pulmonary surfactant, or PS, is a substance that decreases the surface tension of the water. Pulmonary surfactant is a lipoprotein. It's produced by alveolar cells. Respiratory distress syndrome is a condition sometimes called hyaline membrane disease, in which the surface tension of the water has increased. This is due to a deficiency of the enzymes needed to manufacture the surfactant. As we mentioned, water is sticky, so when the alveoli collapse during expiration, the walls tend to stick together, and it becomes difficult to inhale. Another condition is emphysema. In emphysema, compliance increases, the walls of the alveoli break down, and the inner surface area is decreased. Notice the 2 arrows in the figure. If we take the surface of the alveolus in the healthy lung and straighten it out, it's longer than the surface area of the alveolus lacking the side walls. You are now ready to continue with Unit 20, Respiratory System, Part D and Part E.